Okay, so I thought I would mention a couple principles of my synergy and so on too, which is the previous game design ideas for mechanics for a single video game are designed in idea. The idea is to allow four or five types of players and keep everyone in the game on some level for some fights, for a bunch of fights, not necessarily every fight entirely, but most of them at least. And that is giving about four options for combat weapons for any given person, or tools like elements for spells for any given person, with priests as the support for the most part, with their own unique brand of attack spells and so on. The priest spells would be partly balanced by high mana usage, but be slightly higher damage, and so on. But yeah. This means that someone who's mostly a fighter, like 90% fighter, 10% mage, or 90% fighter, 10% priest, has, or 80% fighter, 10% mage and priest, 10% mage, 10% priest, that is, 80% fighter, or someone who's like all agility and intelligence, has options and a niche role that they can fulfill decently. For instance, a agility and intelligence character could use bows and crossbows to good effect, but also spells. The higher level spells will be used, mostly useful for clearing out groups of enemies. And the point of the single target weapon scaling and balance is to make it so that they're good against a single target. With a couple backup options that I mentioned previously about scrolls and like the final skill of like 5, 6, 7 elemental darts that can stack a little bit, being for single target for high mana usage, and so on. What that means is pure fighters, pure mages, 50-50 hybrids, and 80%, 20% focused characters can do a lot of things. All of them can. And will be useful regardless of a very big variety of situations. Now, to help that along, I've come up with 3 different versions of damage reduction. Keep in mind, these are not necessarily going to be, how do I put this? They're not necessarily going to be like ramped up to the 9s. But my goal is to use a light touch on these things to keep, for instance, goblins in the game, so to speak, without health scaling on the or damage sponging necessarily on the enemy side, but keep them resilient a little bit towards damage, so that you can't one-shot them at level 5, and then you got 45 more levels to like you have to get new sprites and enemy types completely and so on. The goal is to make so that if I add a new enemy type, it's a genuine raw statistical difference that makes a strategic or tactical difference, and it's simple to understand. So the 3 damage reduction types are flat damage reduction, which I'll call armor, a Skyrim or Fallout 4 style defense rating, which means like if you have 10 damage done and they have 5 armor defense rating, then you're doing about 35% damage reduction there. And if they have 10 defense rating and you do 10 damage, then it's about 50% damage reduction. And if they have like 20 damage defense rating and you do 10 damage, then you're got like 70% damage reduction. And the point of that is you can out level it, and it gets diminishing returns if it's too high and it gets heightened returns if it's too low. So that way mid-game goblins will take like 1 to 3 hits or 2 to 3 hits instead of 4 or 5 early game, and then like 1 or 2 hits late game basically. And the final layer of protection will be resilience. And resilience will be flat percentage damage reduction. What this layer does, for instance, is since elemental damage will not be affected by armor or defense rating. The point of it is to how do I put this? The point of it is to add a little bit of protection against magic users so that they don't scale too heavily, and also adds a little variety of protection from elemental damage so that like a fire elemental doesn't need to have heavy armor and defense rating against magic. You can just put 90% flame resilience onto it, which means 90% fire damage reduction, and like maybe add vulnerabilities, or maybe not even, because wizard's damage is going to outscale warrior damage unless they spec into weapon skills and strength, or weapon skills and agility basically. But I'll have 3 resiliences. I'll have physical resilience, elemental resilience, and spiritual resilience. And I might add arcane style damage to mage spell repertoire. But it will probably be late game stuff to some extent. And early game, a lot of monsters will have spiritual resilience on some level or something like that to keep naturally priests buffing and healing and so on. What this means is an earth golem, for instance, might have like 70% earth damage reduction and 30% physical resilience, earth damage resilience, elemental resilience, let's say. I'll make it the 4 elements basically, and so on. Physical 4 elements and spiritual / arcane resiliences. So there'll be 6 resiliences and so on, so that I can tune elementals and specialty units that are aspected towards a certain element to be really resilient against magic damage of the same type. But I'll add vulnerability as well, which will do percent damage increase and so on. What this means is armor and defense rating are unique to physical damage, And physical resilience is unique to physical damage. Elemental, the four elements, and arcane slash spiritual will be unique to mages and priests, high level mage spells and priests. And basically, the point is, I could make like a undead who is like divine on some level, and like maybe it's a little tough against physical because it's like a revenant or something, or like a revenant paladin or something is what I would call it, or something. And like it would have some reasonable defense against physical, but the arcane and spiritual resilience, because it's a paladin, would be pretty heavy. Maybe I'd even separate arcane and spiritual damage actually, so that there's seven different resilience percentage damage reduction options. And like this undead paladin will be unique because he's got the armor and stuff like that, but he's also uniquely not going to be taken down by priest attacks like destroy undead as much. Unlike typical undead, which would be utterly vulnerable to it, and so on. And that's my idea and why I would implement it this way, and so on. And then by adding vulnerabilities that are kind of like you can see the thing and you can guess based on the name and the icon and so on that it's or you can like maybe based on the name and the icon and so on, you can kind of intuitively guess that it's not going to be like easy to take down physically, or like through fire magic or spiritual magic or something like that. And so for physical damage, there'll be 3 layers for sure. And for magical damage, there'll be 1 layer of damage reduction components and so on. And I'll carefully craft and balance the enemy units for a variety of these things and so on. This way, it's about choosing the right tool for the job more often than it is just sucking through it and getting lucky and so on. So the entire point of my RPG is that each different character out of a 6-man party has approximately 4 to 6 options at any given time for dealing with enemies on some level. The goal is basically just, pick the right option for that particular situation based on your party character, your character group. And like weapon switching will be a thing. You can switch weapons in mid-game. You can't switch armor in combat, though. Sorry, you can switch weapons mid-combat. Priests and mages will have options of spells at any given time. Just click the magic or priest spell icon, and like options will pop up for all the spells and so on. So like the point is to give people multiple things so that they can tailor their method mid-combat to the situation. Kind of like, in a sense, how Fallout New Vegas does its weapons and armor ammunition subtypes based on enemy you're shooting. And in Fallout New Vegas how if there's like a Deathclaw, or maybe not a Deathclaw, a super mutant, let's say, a Brotherhood of Steel Paladin, I know this isn't real, but humor me for this, and like a bandit, let's say, a raider, You would probably pick the armor-piercing weapon for the Brotherhood of Steel Paladin. You would pick the most damaging weapon for raw damage, like a shotgun, let's say, where flat damage reduction really hits hard against it, but it does have more damage potential if it's unarmored for the super mutant next. And then you would switch to a cheap gun that doesn't do a lot of damage, but the bullets are really inexpensive or cheap for the Raider or something like that. Like, that's the kind of thinking that would go into fights and so on for magic, weapon types, or ammunition types rather, and so on. And the thing is, by adding physical percent damage reduction as resilience, what this means is elemental arrows and so on, and those kinds of things can be useful even against regular, not elementally vulnerable enemies, and so on. And this means a really light touch on defense rating and armor if you're adding resilience to it. And I'm not sure if I would add damage like armor fracturing or corrosion that I mentioned previously to I'm not sure I would make that affect resilience. I think I would make it a physical trait of the entity itself, so that you could reduce armor and it would reduce the flat damage value and the defense rate and relative algebra, Fallout 4, Skyrim, armor versus damage from hits. Stat. But there would be a limit on how much you could do. So like a demon might have like 30% resilience against all traits and have armor on, or something like that, or like 50% arcane resilience and like 30% resilience against everything except spiritual, and then like high armor because he's an armored character or something. And like you could, the armor piercing would be useful for the armor and the defense rating, but it wouldn't be useful for the physical resilience. Or I might leave off physical resilience for the demon, mostly, maybe make it 15%, and then the armor reduction would make it 30%, whereas for the mage it was 30% for all his elements, except arcane, which is 50%, and then the priest would be uniquely good at taking down the demon. You know, and sort of doing things like that, basically. That's what this level of complexity could give, and it would be reasonably intuitive and so on. I wouldn't make it like confusing. I wouldn't like, because basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the enemy types relatively simple unless it's like really obvious that it's got some characteristics. Like the divine undead paladin, or like let's say an angel, like is your enemy or something, then like spiritual attacks won't do jack all, but maybe arcane attacks do extra or something like that. And like maybe they have a light resistance against elements and physical, and they have either medium armor or high armor or something like that. Like, you know what I mean? Maybe the angel wouldn't have that much armor, but he'd be physically resistant a little bit and so on. And then I could add ghosts, which are like 90% physical resilient with no armor whatsoever. And like they're vulnerable to elements to some extent. They're vulnerable to like they wouldn't be specially vulnerable, but you could damage them 1-to-1 with elements, or like you could do a little bit of arcane damage, and again they'd be extra vulnerable to spiritual attacks and so on. And that way there'd be a unique niche to have like one character who can do priest spells, one character who can do mage spells, and like 4 characters who can do whatever the hell you want. Maybe a tank, so a high constitution character would be good. But then you have 3 characters to play with exactly how you choose, no matter what, once the 3 roles of support, DPS, and tank are accounted for. And you could play however you wanted, and basically the point of giving all these elemental options to all these characters and so on is precisely so that you have a set of options for any given thing. And also this would allow me to play around with enemy types somewhat while having a core of simple creatures that stay in the game longer, so that I can make the special enemies more unique and characteristic in a more of them, basically, and really play with enemy army types and so on to maximize novelty and so on, while not being unfair to the player in any way, shape, or form, but rewarding selective usage of the right tool for the job in any given fight, basically, and so on. And it wouldn't just be like Final Fantasy, don't use fire on Ifrit kind of stuff. It would be that, but it would also be like, if you have, like, let's say early game you have 5 goblins, and late game you have 5 giants, and that's basically equivalent to each other on some level, relative to early game and late game characters. Then I can have 5 goblins, and then I could have 7 goblins or 5 goblins and a giant mid game, and then I could have like 3 giants and 7 goblins late game, and like it would be just as tough with those same enemies, and so on. And then there would be end game, where the mid game and so on creatures just start disappearing, and the specialty enemies start appearing a little bit, and so on. The early game creatures disappear late game, or late game, end game maybe, or forget that. Basically, the early game creatures could disappear late end game. So there's early, middle, late, and end game. And end game could be where the specialty enemies really thrive and so on, for a total war against the gods sort of level of like, wow, that's crazy, bro, experience. Once you've mastered the game by playing through it for a long time. And that's how I would advance the meta of gameplay, while keeping the majority of the game slightly more complicated as time goes. And the point is to learn to play the game while playing the game, basically. And I would use old enemy types more or less in new ways, instead of adding brand new enemies after late game and so on. And it would just be a matter of army composition and so on. So you'd already know how to deal with each individual unit, but the army composition would be more complicated on some level. So it would be kind of like chess once you've learned the basics, as opposed to checkers or something. Yeah. So that's how I do it, basically. And the point of this is you can out-level everything, and I'll have a difficulty of easy, medium, and hard. And easy, medium, and hard only... easy will be like 30% reduction of enemy defense, damage, values. Medium will be 100%, and hard will be like 120%. For the defense and damage values or something, So the point of this entire process is to tailor your gaming experience on what you want to do, and to let you power level, grind beyond power rating of the enemy for late game, even if you want, end game even if you want, but to reward tactical thinking and logistics, basically. So it's a combination of Jeff Vogel Spiderweb Software games like Avernum. It's a combination of Tibia. It's a combination of Final Fantasy. And it's like those systems. And it's a combination of like Skyrim, Fallout 4 as well. And this would give quite an experience, I believe, without being unfair, without being restrictive, and without being without necessarily creating a no-win state for a certain party design whatsoever. Yeah. And also the 3 layers of defense, the flat, the algebra ratio, and the percentage, also enables enemies to stay in the game for longer without adding to their health like in Fallout 4 or Skyrim or something like that, so that there's no damage sponges that aren't intended specifically to be damage sponges. Only the character's health will grow and so on. And their resilience, percentage-wise and algebra ratio-wise, defense rating, will determine how long they live and so on. So if you don't up your damage much, you'll be able to fight them relatively, you'll be able to kill them basically a little bit easier. And if you focus on defensive stuff so you outlast the opponent, that's going to be a possibility. If you focus on all 6 being nuker mages or something, that'll be like a possibility. Like all the options will, more or less all the options will be viable on some level without like artificially grafting onto this whole holistic system of gameplay mechanics and so on. Anyways, that's the plan at least. And it'll take a light touch on armor, defense rating, and resilience. But if I do it properly, then it'll like blow up the possibilities of this game without like having to make like 10 different types of the same medium powerful goblin. So I can focus on enemy types like Goblin, Goblin Juggernaut, Goblin Skirmisher, Goblin Rogue, Goblin Shaman, and so on, enemy types, without like Goblin level 1, Goblin level 2, Goblin level 3, and so on. And that's the plan.